Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the first session of the fourth season of Shelter in Places, a public program organized by a group of researchers interested in parallel academia at the New Center for Research and Practice. Shelter in Places first emerged as a response to the sudden disappearance of physical interactions after the rise of COVID-19. We decided to compensate for this loss of casual exchange of ideas by creating online spaces that allow for a variety of conversation topics. As an online institution that has experimented with many different forms of knowledge production and communication across the globe since 2014, the New Center can put this experience to use in the service of public good. As we confront the sense of urgency that pervades our world, Shelter in Places is meant to be a place for discussing and thinking together. So my name is Martina Cavalot, and alongside my colleague, Katherine Adams, today we are joined by the programmers at the New Center for Research and Practice. Thank you all for being here with us, a warm welcome, and we're very happy to have you in our screen space today.
I second Martina. Welcome, everyone. I'll briefly introduce our guests before we start the discussion. So today we have Ed Keller, who with Carla Leitão heads the program in PostPlanetary Universal Design, Jason Mohaghegh heading the Transdisciplinary Studies program, Reza Negarestani, who's programmer of critical philosophy, and Mohammad Salemy, programmer in art and curatorial practice and organizer at the New Center. We'd like to open the discussion with our curatorial statement on the topic for today, which is pedagogical programming. The process of knowledge extraction inherited from standard pedagogical approaches strives for the total apprehension of the world, but rarely can it adequately capture the complex scope of contemporary crises. As the cycle of reality continues to exceed this supposed completeness, enclosed academic terrains must expand their ambit to account for the dismantling of the linear development of epistemologies. What can the para-academic space open up, particularly in the midst of a crisis that seems to continually miss the point of resolution? With a panel of the New Center's respective programmers, we will discuss topics relating to the epistemology of transdisciplinary research, the commitment to planetary orientation within disciplines, and the role of rigor as a compass for thinking in the open.
So we're all quite familiar with our cohort today, but it's really quite exciting to have the opportunity and the pleasure to welcome and engage in conversation with Ed Keller, and hopefully very soon with Carla Leitão too, whose program in PostPlanetary Universal Design is premiering this term at the New Center. So we thought we'd just take a brief moment to introduce Ed to our public. Ed Keller is a designer, professor, writer, musician, multimedia artist, and independent scholar. From 2012 to 2020, he was the director of the Center for Transformative Media at the New School, associate dean at Parsons between 2010 and 2012, and from 2009 to 2020 was associate professor at Parsons. Previous academic appointments include Columbia University between 1998 and 2010, as professor teaching advanced architectural design graduate studios and seminars, and serving as the acting director of the AAD MS program in 2001, SciArc between 2004 and 2009, where he founded and coordinated the Mediascapes program and was full-time faculty between 2007 and 2009, and RPI, UPenn, Pratt, Parsons, FIU, and Bennington, variously, between 1996 and 2010. He has spoken on architecture, film, artificial intelligence, technology, and ecology internationally. Recent seminars at the New School and Parsons include post-planetary design, soundscape, and designing AI. So it's my pleasure to welcome you today, Ed. We're very glad to have you here.
Thank you.
So we'll start now a conversation around the various programs, starting with post-planetary universal design and its main themes. And I just want to also take a brief moment to say that we'll be taking questions about each program at the end. So if anyone who's in the public, please feel free to pop in a question in the chat box or in the Q&A within the Zoom recording, and we'll be able to circle back to it later. So as a starting remark, it seems that the rise and the latest developments in computational systems have pushed the framework of cognitive mapping to its furthest limits by eroding the remaining trace of a correspondence between abstraction and representation, and by also exposing the limit of human cognition, whose apprehension of space and time is incrementally mediated. The concepts of temporality and spatiality in particular seem incredibly elusive and somewhat lacking a physical dimension, which makes it a very ripe time to rethink and perhaps deploy design and architecture as tools for orientation. So from this initial premise, how would you chart the shift from, and also what is the significance of the shift from the global to the planetary, and then again to the post-planetary? How do we make sense of time and space in this new configuration, and how design and architecture serve in this new geometry?
Martina, thank you very much for that introduction. Well, you know, one of the backstories to the question of post-planetary that, at least in my case, has strongly influenced the approach has been a series of researches and academic projects at both SCI-Arc and at Columbia since 2007, 2008. We looked at empire and post-empire as a design problem, both an architectural design problem and infrastructure and regional design problem. And that was a kind of a core thematic focus in the Mediascapes program at SCI-Arc, which I founded. We were interested in what it would mean to design for alternate empires, or to design for the fall of empire. And on a personal level, I've been an avid science fiction reader since I was a very young child. I was exposed at much too early an age to J.G. Ballard and various other writers, and they left a permanent mark on me. And so coming out of 2009, 2010, the problem of designing for existential risk, not just design at an infrastructural scale or a planetary scale, in acknowledgement of people like Buckminster Fuller, in acknowledgement of Doxiadis, and many others who tried to think at that scale back in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. We asked, well, what would it mean to reframe this in the context of existential risk? And the post-planetary seminars, which I taught at Parsons from, I think, 2012 to 2019, and at the New School generally, because we had a really wide range of people enrolling in those seminars, tried to take that to that level, to ask the question, what does it mean, as you put it, in the face of a kind of a shifting terrain where cognitive mapping, as Jameson himself pointed out back in the 90s, had reached its limits or was facing a completely new set of challenges, could either be discarded. I think the term he uses in the geopolitical aesthetic is actually like a ladder that you kick out from underneath yourself, or could be reinvigorated in some way. So what does it mean to think the post-planetary? I also, you know, I always would start the post-planetary seminars off by acknowledging that the term itself is a bait and switch. You know, you get into the room and you realize that we're really not thinking about leaving the planet. It's like the scene in The Little Prince, je quitte ma planète, you know, and you're being carried away by birds dragging you off into the infinite reaches of space. It's not exactly that, but it is that. And in the sense that it's a bait and switch, it's to frame the question, should we be thinking of leaving the planet, of going beyond the planet, or should we really recognize that we have always thought of the problem of universalist terms? And for me, the Xenofeminist Manifesto has been a particularly impactful way of reframing the problem of universalism against the problem of the non-human, trying to be completely embracing of all points of view, of all ontologies, while at the same time arguing for some form of, dare I say it, some form of compassion or some form of transhuman empathy. And so this is the kind of backstory that leads to the question of post-planetary design, in the sense that we would ask, how do we frame ourselves and our epistemological limits against a planetary horizon and beyond a planetary horizon, and then make critical decisions in terms of how to bring those beyond the human horizons back into the frame of the human design challenges that we face. So on a personal level, again, you know, I have very, very strong memories from my childhood of going on long road trips with my parents and sitting in the back of the car reading a compilation that Harlan Ellison put together, I think in the late 60s or early 70s, called Dangerous Visions and Again Dangerous Visions. And it ran the gamut from people like Ballard, Ursula Le Guin, to many, many other science fiction writers. And so there's a kind of a deep, almost childhood trauma, if you will, of spending days in the car reading and reading and reading these stories and having them creep very, very deeply into the kind of nascent epistemological frameworks that I myself was trying to build out as a young human. So that for me is the kind of starting point and the framework in relationship to the postplanetary universal design question. For Carla, if I can speak for her very briefly, for 7 or 8 years now, she's been working as a faculty at Rensselaer Polytechnic. She's been there since 2010, but for 7 or 8 years, she's been doing all of her design studios and seminars in a lab there called the Crave Lab. It's a kind of a cube lab, a 360 video space, 40 by 40 feet, 15 feet high, with a 128 channel sound system, really quite extraordinary immersive space. And what Carla has been doing is trying to reimagine architectural typologies, running the gamut from control rooms to interactive spaces, to landscapes of massive oblivion, to what she has termed the planetology design problem, designing for species, infrastructure, and technology at the scale of the planet and beyond. And in all of those studios and seminars, using the Crave Lab as a kind of an immersive environment through which to both design, but then of course to present and test those. And Carla and I share a deep love of both writers like Stanislaw Lem and his novel Solaris and his Summa, but also science fiction in general as a way to think speculatively beyond the kind of challenges that, again, Martina, you've pointed out in relationship to human cognition at its limit, the models of spatiality and temporality that we've used in architecture at their limit. If I can add just one more comment here that's related to the program. For us, the question of what architecture does as a kind of a codec, as a compression-decompression algorithm is crucial for Carla and myself. One way of thinking of architecture is as a way of encoding capital and material intensivities, framing them in a very material way, and then projecting them forward into the future. So socio-political, technical, economic relationships, cultural relationships, architecture captures those. It reifies them, and it projects those relationships forward into the future. Now, there's a very beautiful anecdote that Fernando Galeano uses at the beginning of his book, Fire and Memory, talking about the primitive humans wandering in the forest, coming upon a clearing with some wood and having to make the decision, do we build a small hut out of the wood or do we burn it and create a bonfire? Now, typically in the kind of text of architecture's foundation, they build a little hut and they shelter. And then if they ever come back upon that clearing, they have a hut. Their moment has been projected forward into the future. But Fernandez Galeano makes the argument that we actually should think of the bonfire as an architectural event as well. And he tries to contextualize that in the framework of Margalef, Stengers, Prigogine, to try to understand how architecture as an act, both in conflagration, but also in permanence, functions. And so for us in the question of postplanetary and universal design, that's also a kind of an important framework, thinking expenditure, thinking energy, thinking conservation, thinking projection of current conditions, the state of things, if you will, into the future, and to trying to critically decide which portions of the state of things actually should be conserved, should be projected into the future, and to ask how big a bonfire, if you will, again, we should be envisioning instead of a conservation and a projection into the future. So I hope that with that kind of wild set of themes I'm trying to tie together, this commitment to planetary orientation that you bring up is at least partially addressed.
Great, thank you, Ed. We have one follow-up question to that, which has to do with computational design, which appears to be a strong theme within your program. And in addition to a classical idea of extended space, of course, the internet offers its own new paradigm of public space, both a virtual commons and a virtual space which has its own paradigm of scale and vastness. And this expansion of a digital or virtual public space seems linked also to new techniques in computational design, which, as I've noted, seem to be a strong theme in your program. So I wonder if you could say whether you're thinking about the PostPlanetary as related at all to this other kind of maybe spatial infinity or virtual scale that is offered by the internet. And even if not, if you could say a few remarks about how those techniques are integrated into your programming.
Absolutely. We're really, really delighted and fortunate that we'll be joined in our first semester by Ezio Blazzetti and Danielle Willems. And they're the co-founders of Meta Design. They're both architects. They're both virtuosos at computational design, if you will. And they have they've framed the problem of programming ontologies in relationship to their background in coding material systems as well as in coding space. And when we began discussing what it would mean for them to run a seminar on programming ontologies, it was informed substantially by my knowledge of their work and the collaborations that we've had with them over the years. Also, our knowledge of the work that Ezio had done in his collaborations with Cecil Ballman teaching at University of Pennsylvania. Cecil is a world-renowned engineer, mathematician, polymath, who's engineered some of the most important buildings in the past 20 or 30 years. And I was lucky enough to see a number of their reviews, I think, over the past 5 or 6 years. And always what Ezio and Danielle, and in the case of their collaboration with Cecil, what they've taken on has been an inquiry to ask at what scale one can program an ontology, and then at what scales that particular programmed ontology will intersect with a widely distributed range of other potentially independent ontologies. For myself and for Carla, in her research over the past decade on the archive and archive typologies, both in architectural space, but generally programmed archives, we've been very influenced by Michael Whitmore's concept of massive addressability, which Whitmore takes out of a study of Shakespeare's work, but which Whitmore very economically writes about as a concept which could be applicable across many disciplines. And for us, the concept of massive addressability poses a question. The question being, how much are all systems already in communication with each other? What are the input-output channels that any given material system, economic system, energetic system has with the systems around it? And as designers, this becomes a kind of a point of intervention for us. And this is what would drive the PostPlanetary universalist platform, if you will. Identifying where input-output channels exist in systems and where they can be pruned, where they can be enhanced and amplified, and imagining that all within the concept of a range of programmed ontologies, again, if you will. So Ezio and Danielle's work has taken this on for more than a decade. And this is the kind of starting point for us. I think it's important, as you both have put it, to try to understand where that intersects with the limits of human cognitive maps. We're inviting a number of people in to participate in the lecture series this first spring, including Ben Gertzel. Ben is someone we've collaborated on a number of events with in the past 7 or 8 years. When I was at the New School directing CTM, we hosted the Human Level Artificial Intelligence Conference Series in 2016. It was also one of the first opportunities we had to collaborate with the New Center. We hosted their AGI Accelerate General Intellect series for a day. I think Reza was at that, Patricia Reed, Nick Land, Pete Wolfendale, Mo, a number of other people. They participated in a panel in the Future of Mind event that we hosted as part of the Human Level AI Week. And Ben will be one of our inaugural lecturers. Ben's work runs the gamut from philosophy to mathematics to, in his project, Singularity Net, the building out of an open source, worldwide shared platform for artificial general intelligence. And so what we're trying to do, in a way, is what I had hoped to do back in 2016. We're trying to bring people who are thought leaders and developers pushing the limits of AGI technically in their work into dialogue with people who, on the transdisciplinary level, with programs like Jason's, on the level of philosophy, a critical philosophy with programs like Reza's, doing actually the most leading work in those spaces. And I actually had very strong hopes back in 2016 that bringing folks like Patricia, Pete Wolfendale, and Ben Goertzel, Reza together would be in some way a kind of catalytic seed for people who were thinking both on the left and right side of the spectrum in acceleration, together with people who were doing the most important work in philosophy, transdisciplinary design, and artificial general intelligence coding. So this is a kind of this is a broader platform ambition for what we're thinking of with postplanetary universal design, but it goes back to the events that we have put together across the past decade. And it does try to take on these questions that you're raising, again, in relationship to the limits of human cognitive mapping. I should wrap up there because I think I've been speaking for quite a while, but I wanted to drop a couple of those placeholders with reference to previous projects that we've taken on that a number of people at the New Center have been involved with, that I have great hopes will lead into what we're doing in the next year or two with postplanetary universal design.
Great, thank you, Ed, for that. That's great to hear about all that you're working on with that program. Now we'll move on to Jason Mohaghegh, who is the programmer of Transdisciplinary Studies, and we'll open a conversation about the program and some of its themes. So to start, our first question has to do with what you consider the transdisciplinary within this program. It seems that beyond just drawing from disparate disciplines, which might assume that the position of the subject of knowledge isn't fundamentally questioned, the Transdisciplinary Studies program also involves considering various displacements of the epistemological subject, in the sense that transdisciplinary research often seems to chart the epistemology of a unique subject. And in this semester, that could be the subject caught between art and power, the collective subject of the internet, even the subject of an undocumented madness. In particular, in the New Center program, there seems to be an engagement with these liminal subjects, whether individual or collective, who, as noted, are forced to organize their own conceptual schema. So it seems that maybe you're dealing with a liminal space or a transversal space, not only in terms of the theory's content, but also in terms of that subject. And I wonder if you could say a bit about how these forms of displacement do or don't shape your programming, and what you think is the position of this transdisciplinary subject.
Absolutely, that was brilliantly articulated. I would offer a few paradigms to answer the question of how we engage the transdisciplinary. And the first is that it sounds like some cutting edge academic neologism, but I actually think of the transdisciplinary as having an ancient propensity to it, in the sense that, you know, being transdisciplinary allows us to restore ourselves to the elemental versions of the imagination and imaginative forces. So before various fields were segmented, formalized, and codified into symbolic regimes, they were just these bare electric live wire formulations. You know, there was a great Sufi master, that Reza would know this, that when he was asked to define mysticism, he said, when there was no name for it, there was mysticism. When they called it mysticism, it ceased to exist. So before we designated the titles of philosophy, art, literature, psychology, music, theater, we simply dealt with creative executions of what we would call thought, image, storytelling, mood, sound, movement. And I say simply as if it's a matter of primitive simplicity, but I actually think that these elemental manifestations are far more intricate and complex ultimately. Another way of looking at it is that transdisciplinary kind of also brings us back to the legend of Pandora's box, which is again another ancient sort of a prototype. Since to be transdisciplinary is not to be exclusively devoted to the one, we can, like Pandora, sort of free a kind of infinity string of concepts, territories, and figures. But there are two crucial details to remember and derive from the original legend of Pandora's box, which is that first, the primary impulse behind it was curiosity, not a search for truth or reason or self or being or beauty, but a razor-sharp edge of fascination and intrigue that was kind of a childlike mix of malevolence and innocence that then unleashes entire worlds of possibility. And the second thing to remember about Pandora's box is that all of these anarchic trajectories are unlocked in simultaneity, which means all the trajectories are happening at once. So really, for me, the only other event that emulates this kind of chaotic synchronicity is the carnival. And that's another way that I think of the Transdisciplinary Studies program. I see it as a decentralized kaleidoscopic architecture. And that through these fragmentary and prismatic modes, it hosts a multidimensional spectacle. And also, just like Pandora's box and the carnival, it's all about the alignment of rare or extraordinary manifestations at the same time. So that would be the second way. The third thing is that I also think transdisciplinary is not just ancient, but medieval. Medieval in the sense of the alchemists. So if we take the strange experiments of the alchemists, we realize that they were the first ones really to be interested in admixture, collusion, paradox, distortion, poison, and contamination. And above all else, and this is the most important thing for me, finding techniques to turn things against themselves, which means to make substances betray themselves and become unnatural forms. And I think that's what's at the heart of the Transdisciplinary Studies program too, is a type of trickery that, to put it dramatically, I mean, when you can turn something into something other than what it is, you've overthrown what the medievals called destiny itself. And that's a hell of a trick to pull off. The next thing I just say quickly to that, Katherine, because I think you, when you brought up the liminal, it resuscitates this notion, is that the entire philosophical discourse of the middle and the unparalleled power of what it means to be in the middle. Disciplines are based on, I'm not taking shots here at anybody, but disciplines are based on imagined traditions. And traditions are based on mythic structures. And myths are all about establishing origins. That's just a fact of the genre. But being transdisciplinary eludes being caught in an erotic relation either to your origin, your beginning, or your future. Instead, we follow a different genre, which is not myths that are always about identity, belonging, and mapping the genesis of things, but rather the fairy tale, which is always about being on the way or in between and navigating fluidly from surface to surface. Many of you probably know that Deleuze and Guattari had this amazing observation when they were discussing skiing, that the momentum of the skier, all of the speed and the intensity of the skier is generated from the middle. So occupying transdisciplinary modes is about that art of traversal, the art of trespass, mastering the nexus or the crossing or the middle, or as you put it, the liminal, and realizing that indeed dealing in the trans necessarily also puts us in the role of the trafficker. And I do see it as a criminal enterprise in that regard, to smuggle things across borders, not to be enslaved to linearity or chronos or telos that most disciplines bow before in order to restore themselves as legitimate enterprises. Instead, we're after an interest in the perfect crime. And perfect crimes always require an understanding of hybridity, just like the sewing together of the hybrid limbs of the Frankenstein monster is what produces this exceptional sort of event in the story of Frankenstein. You know, it reminds me too, I'm quoting a lot today, but it reminds me too of something Baudrillard said that I like a lot once. I'm going to get this all wrong, but he said something to the effect of, there is no more philosophy in philosophy. If you want philosophy, go to literature. But there's no more literature in literature. If you want literature, go to film. If you want film, go to sculpture. If you want sculpture, go to architecture. If you want architecture, go to dance. And if you want dance, go back to philosophy. And I like this. And tangibly speaking, many of you probably know the iconic great avant-garde artist Yves Klein and some of his backstory. And so sometimes you can read into him on Wikipedia or wherever, sometimes it does take a judo master to revolutionize the very nature of painting. And just the last thing that I'll say, just to give my final sort of paradigm for this, I think of transdisciplinary, if we want to take a darker reading of this tactic of the transdisciplinary, I think of it as guerrilla warfare. Asynchronous, irregular patterns of ambush, strike and withdraw, invasion and disappearance. I take it very seriously that transdisciplinary methods allow, I mean, this is why we have a lot of non-Western sort of representations, why we have a great deal of diverse figures and forms that have been excluded from so-called traditions and disciplines. Transdisciplinary methods allow outnumbered, exiled, or outcast groups to operate in the arena of world violence. And by violence, I mean something different than political violence. Just means waging counter-inflictions and gaining strongholds. And for this, though, you do have to start from the premise that to think itself is already to enter the state of war or the theater of war. And so while there's this enchanting dimension, I also think there's a severe dimension to entering the transdisciplinary mode. Awesome.
Thank you, Jason. That was really brilliant and actually quite fitting in regards to something else that we were looking to ask you about, which is that one other key feature of the transdisciplinary program seems to be that it not only looks at different epistemologies in a way, but also different kinds of mythologies and temporalities, which you just clearly mentioned in your reference to the ancient and the medieval. So we're kind of broadly interested in knowing how this informs your way of thinking of the contemporary, because there seems to be quite a substantial difference between using these stories as kind of historical materials or actually deploying them as objects for the construction of a new sense of the contemporary, which you seem to be doing a lot in your own work, as well as the programming decisions that you make in your program. So if you'd like to comment a bit on that.
Sure, thank you, Martina. Again, that was, I think, perfect too. I should have both of you write descriptions of the program for us. I think I can speak on behalf of everyone that we have lined up for the coming term. Dejan Lukic, who goes back into the ancient and the medieval as well. Yuna Chung, whose work she traverses between Eastern mysticism and contemporary theory. That again, transdisciplinary sounds like a contemporary academic terminology, but to me, it's one of the most anti-academic sort of endeavors you could imagine. And the reason for that is that in the Enlightenment is when we really had obviously we had the naming of traditions before the Enlightenment, but the Enlightenment stratified and institutionalized in the modern academy this fracturing sort of into highly exclusivist, highly insular, sort of compartmentalized modes of thought. So the sociologists don't talk to the psychologists don't talk to the anthropologists don't talk to the architects, and they all sort of just inhabit these incestuous conference spaces where they talk in their own closed circles, and often become increasingly necrophilic in terms of just referencing, their pantheons, their dead pantheons. I mean, you can go to, and Reza, I think will back me up on this, you can go to standard academic philosophy conferences, and it may as well be, burial rites sort of conferences. Every single paper that's delivered has to have the name of a dead person in it. I mean, it's almost just understood and implicit that, Heidegger's this of this and this, Roland Barthes this and this and this, Derrida's this and this and this. And it becomes this strange kind of pathetic ritual of diminished returns and of kind of de-exponential reductions in a way. So yes, I would say that there's also, for me, an important thing, because it wasn't just some abstract idea of thought or disciplines that got fractured, but human subjectivity did as well. There is something pitifully dysfunctional about the modern psyche, where you have this sort of the unconscious, the conscious, and all that. You can think things you wouldn't say. You can say things you wouldn't do. You would do things, but you can't think about them. This is horrible. You know, what happens to sort of the age of synchronicity, like the animal or the child, whose sort of impulses are perfectly aligned with the mind, perfectly aligned with the body, with sensation, with desire. There isn't this debilitating, paralyzing doubt, narcissistic crises, should I, shouldn't I do this, and all that. You see this only today, really, with great schizophrenics who have that kind of wonderful, and it's not to romanticize schizophrenia, but the great schizophrenic authors have that fluidity, where mind, body, sensation, desire also. Transdisciplinary to me then, and I blame the academic model, I blame what's happened to sort of fields of inquiry, to contemplation and consciousness itself. Transdisciplinary then is an attempt to undo some of the sort of the paralyzing harms, the conspiracy of that shattering. And it's not towards unity. There are ways of forming constellations. Ed can speak to this brilliantly as a design person. There are ways you can form, you know, crystallic formations that are not about perfect absolute unities, but you know that nevertheless have a plane of consistency. They have continuity. They can align one another with one another in sort of brilliant ways. And so you look at the medieval scholars. Reza can't tell me he's I know his bookshelf. He goes and he reads the same people too. You look at the medieval scholars, they make us feel terrible when you look at the vastness and expanse of what they covered. Books on animals, books on light, you know, books on weather, books on political philosophy, books on, you know, and just every subject imaginable that they would follow the whims, you know, of whatever they wanted to do without that, those sense of borders or that sense of territoriality. So I would say that, Martina, in answer to your question, yeah, that to me, the contemporary is a threshold where we can actually try and invite ourselves back to that abyss where all bets were off and anything goes in terms of topics and figures and trajectories. You know, and I have spent, just for practical, since you asked about my own work, I spent 20 years as a barbarian at the gates trying to usher in non-Western modes of thought into the realms of central global philosophy. You guys should come to me at these conferences sometimes, you know, for the great philosophical crowd, and see that when you put on a cutting edge panel on Palestinian perceptions of time, right? Palestinian philosophy of time, and you get 3 people to show up for it because they would rather go to their Foucault circle or their Nietzsche circle, here I'll even say my favorite, and rehearse terrible papers that Nietzsche himself would hate and that Foucault himself would never want to listen to. I mean, there's something deeply flawed about these mechanisms. So that's part of the game.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Jason. And I think your comments and your preoccupations resonate with, I think, all of us, and particularly, I think that leaves us in a good place to think further about consistency, and especially consistency within systems of thinking, and maybe address that towards Reza a bit more, and talk about his own program in critical philosophy at the New Center. So I guess in a wider sense, there seems to be a tension within knowledge between, on one side, the admission of the incompleteness of systems of thinking, which is kind of to say that there is a concession that other forms of reasoning do exist, and on the other side, to the fact that we do not want to surrender to a kind of facile pluralism, or to the fact that all frames of reference are then worth being considered without formal constraints or orientative guidelines of sorts. So I guess as we take stock of this incompleteness and kind of attended insufficiency of systems and models, both in philosophical thinking, but also as pedagogical approaches, how do we maintain a rigorous approach and not concede to uncritical pluralism? And what are the criteria that we need to retain to kind of build the edifice of a philosophical program? And particularly perhaps the criteria that inform your own decisions for the critical philosophy program here at the New Center. So off to you, Reza.
Thank you so much. Well, I can't actually top either Jason or Ed's extremely eloquent introductions of their respective programs. I would like actually to start with a very personal story, which I've already, mentioned in one of my interviews. But the reason that I'm actually going to recite this story is precisely because I saw a few people of the younger generation, in high school, because this story is about my high school time, said that they have been doing this with other philosophy books, or actually with my books. So the story is that Mohammad knows, Jason knows. In Iran, you either become an engineer or a doctor, or sorry, get the fuck out. It's as simple as that.
Or your parents will hate you forever.
Yes. The same thing about me, yes. But they don't anymore. The thing is that I was always a bookworm of the worst kind. Basically, instead of buying toys, I was buying books. I was crying when I couldn't buy books. I didn't have enough money to buy the books that I want, right? So during the high school, and I was in one of the best high schools in the country, I became one of the worst students. Precisely because, well, I was trained basically to become a doctor, right? And everyone was counting on me in the school that, yeah, he's going to be a doctor. But the thing is that that was not interesting for me. I started to systematically read philosophy back and forth, first from the moderns and contemporaries back to the ancients, and then from ancients back again to the more moderns. So doing these kinds of sweeping movements. And during that, it wasn't just that I was reading philosophy, I was reading everything: novels, mysticism, books on engineering, all sorts of stuff that you shouldn't read during high school while you are preparing for national entrance, university entrance exam. And the thing is that I was always being caught reading this stuff and being grounded or severely reprimanded. So I started to create these kinds of makeshift book covers that they looked like my school books, but inside of them, I was inserting my, philosophy books or literature books. And I was reading them, pretending that I'm actually reading what they want me to read. And of course, the bad lesson, the tragedy for everyone who is naughty, this will happen to you. You don't get admitted to medical school, right? You fail. And I remember that, as I said, this school was second in the country in its ranking. Like literally everyone who goes to this is supposed to actually become a doctor and an engineer. Well, I became an engineer, but I was supposed to become a doctor. The thing is that, so I remember I went basically to the school with my dad, and the principal, who was one of these kind of Islamic fanatics, who was extremely tough on people, said that to my dad, look, among all of the people who have basically, all of the people have passed, become a doctor or engineer. Among all of these people, the only person who has failed is your son. Shame on him for bringing shame on this school. Well, actually, that I am proud of. And the thing is that I read on Twitter, but a couple of students at the News Center told me that they have been doing this. And I'm proud that my students, even though they are in high school, some of them are doing their PhD, they're past those kinds of naughtiness, but really my most important emphasis is always on the young people, teenagers, in fact, because they are going to be the next generation. And essentially, my idea of pedagogy is always about them. People who are in the PhD program, PhD candidates, are interesting. I can teach them, I can converse them, but they are not really fuel my excitement, my demonic excitement of corrupting the youth. But these people do, particularly when they actually do fail intentionally against the whims of their own parents to become finally a philosopher. But the thing is that what I have been trying to teach my students, and in fact, I have curated the whole program around this idea, is that, if you are doing philosophy, knowing what philosophy is or what it is good for, then why the hell are you doing philosophy? Because if you already know beyond the shadow of a doubt what philosophy is and what is it good for, then it is not philosophizing, is it? So this is something that I have always not only taught my students, but also I have injected this to the critical philosophy department, creating a kind of I know, and as Jason thankfully mentioned that, the word transdisciplinarity is like one of the most shallowest words as used by academia. But the thing is that when you actually take it seriously, just like philosophy, it is the greatest ways of thinking about the world. So I have been trying to create a transdisciplinarity within transdisciplinarity inside philosophy, to bring certain kinds of people teaching certain kinds of topics that are never going to be taught in one single department of philosophy across the globe. Cybernetics, computer science, Sellars, Plato, ethics, Hegel, I don't know, and
with a splash of Carnap on top like this.
A splash of Carnap, yes, and Torbid media on in the sky, the haze, yes. So this is kind of a landscape that I wanted to create. But the thing is that, most importantly, for me, the major vision that I had, and I talked this to Mo, and Mo has given me almost 100% liberty to do whatever I want with this program. And thank you so much, Mo. So what I wanted to do this was that, you see, I told Mo that, it's all good to create. So I know that some people who are coming to our program basically are coming in order to become prepared for either their masters, or first becoming philosophy students, getting into masters, or getting into PhD. And of course, certain kinds of people who come just for the sake of engaging with philosophical ideas, right?
And a lot of them are already in PhD because they think their program is not giving them everything they need for the dissertation. So
dissertation, yes, yeah. Yes. So yes, absolutely. And of course, our instructors the same. Instructors like me, myself. I mean, I'm not going to talk about other people, but I wrote Intelligence and Spirit through teaching my courses, right? So essentially, this is our idea. But the core idea that I had in mind was that I didn't want the critical philosophy program to be a certain kind of Maoist up to the mountains, down to the countryside paradigm of re-education camp, right? That basically rejects and outcasts come to New Center Critical Philosophy Department, for them to be re-educated, and then sent back to academia. No. You can still come and go back to academia, right? But the kind of basically education, the kind of program and pedagogy that I had in mind was that if you really decide today that you never go to academia to get a PhD in philosophy, you still can become a philosopher through this program. And of course, not just through, that's the whole point of autodidacticism. You have to mold your world around your ambition, right? To become a philosopher. This is a supplementary, it's a supplement. New Center is a supplement. It's just like a vitamin supplement, a little bit of castor oil, a little bit of omega-3, so on and so forth. But you need to have that kick. You need to be surrounded by like-minded people. Because otherwise, I have seen this, and I always advise my students against this. Over-ambition, particularly with young people who are doing philosophy, over-ambition, over-optimism, leads to pessimism, jadedness, and ultimately quitting from this path. Because doing philosophy, as I mentioned, is like basically, Jason knows that it's a kind of a cheese factor and a cliche that we use always, this Abu Rayhan Biruni, it's like the paragon of enlightenment, Islamic enlightenment philosopher, that as he's dying, he's, instead of like basically saying goodbye to his dear ones, is asking someone who's like around next to his bed that, by the way, what happened to that question? Do you have any sort of solution for it? You see, this is a long path until your death. You're either committed to this very long path or not. It's as simple as that. I am merely exemplifying philosophy, but for any sort of discipline. But philosophy really is a sublimation of such pursuit. Philosophy as life itself, right? So, and of course, this is why I always also advise, don't try to do too much. Don't try to be over-ambitious, because this is business. It's a business when it is in academia. It is not a business when you are actually doing philosophy in good spirit. If you treat it as a business, like academia, I mean like the institutional academia today, you will be extremely unhappy. You will quit. You will actually start to say that philosophy is shit, right? And I have seen so many of my greatest students who have fallen in such traps. Extremely ambitious, extremely doing well, but trying to do much. No, take your pace, slowly. As I said, it's a life pursuit. So if it is a life pursuit, then means that you need to also, and particularly if you are, I'm not talking about academia. You can still be a magnificent philosopher in academia, even in today. But the thing is that, well, there are so many real hurdles that disenchant you about the powers of academia to let you through the gates, right? But you can do it yourself. But doing it yourself is actually even harder, but at the very least, you reap a better reward. But that requires also a means to secure a means of survival. because if you can't survive really economically, you wouldn't be able to do philosophy. Then you will be forced to sell your soul to people you shouldn't sell your soul to. And that is the worst. That is the worst. That is even worse than going to academia. Look, if you want to sell your soul in the business of philosophy, at the very least, sell it to academia. At least these people are cold. They don't want too much from you.
I can just see so many memes created out of these like lecture you gave, Reza. It's like, it's just right for people to take things out of context. Okay, I would like to take few minutes because I'm actually booked to appear in a panel organized by one of our current certificate students who's doing a residency at IBM in New York and has done a fantastic project, and I'm one of the examiners. I have to go and do that. But what I would like to do is to maybe talk few minutes about not the New Center in general, but the art and curatorial program. Okay, so actually I lied. It's going to be about New Center anyways. So I said it on Facebook long ago, you know, New Center is almost like an art school, but an art school in which you don't learn how to make art, but you learn everything else you need to learn to be a good artist. That unfortunately has slowly left the art academia. More and more art academic contexts are not actually giving people what we're able to give to the artists. So I myself come from the arts background. I have an undergrad degree in arts and a master degree from a curatorial and art history program. But my passion personally has been to develop a program, and the people I have in mind are either humanities scholars, humanities, social science scholars, or artists who really are trying to tap into the kind of knowledges that are not available to them these days in art school. I was talking about a book with one of our students the other day, and he said that he's doing research about this, and I said, oh my God, there's this book from the 1950s. She's an art historian, wrote about this. And as I was trying to articulate the name, she said, oh, you're talking about Susan Langer. I said, yes, how do you know? It's like, this is what I mean. This is what's missing. 1950s book from art history that somehow I know about and inform my thesis. But now our younger student, without even my knowledge, has tapped into it because the topic is world making. And Susan Langer is a very important figure in talking about art as a complete virtual world that gives you a whole world, not just a picture, right? So this is sort of like my passion has been to, and I always keep in mind what other programmers are doing of what is the benefit of what Jason's bringing in for the artists, not just for people who are coming from comparative literature or literary studies or transdisciplinary studies. And I will keep my mind also on what Ed and Carla are bringing in. What is the benefit of this for artists? How can artists, without wanting to change their field to architecture, benefit from this? How can artists benefit from philosophers that Reza's bringing? So this has been my kind of like principal goal, right? And for this year's art and curatorial programming, we've got a very dynamic curator who coincidentally graduated for his undergrad from the same art school I went to, Emily Carr University of Art and Design, Vancouver. His name is Post Brothers. He's putting together a very amazing seminar by artists who he calls it parasitical turn, which means artists who are sort of like exploiting or colonizing even something or another practice or some paradigm in order to use it to make art and then also transform that field or that event. So that is the only sort of like the specific art course, but a lot of the seminars that are offered by Ed and Carla's program, Jason's program, and Reza's program are absolutely perfect for artists. In fact, they might even be better for artists than the art one, because the art one is also good for people who don't know anything about contemporary art or know very little about contemporary art, and they want to know what's going on right now in 2021 in the world of contemporary art. And actually that happens in a lot of our seminars. If you look at our archives, you see more than half of the people in an art and curatorial seminar are philosophers or people from other parts of the world of knowledge. They kind of want to know what's going on in the art world. You know, we're always ashamed of telling them what's going on in the art world, but we do our best to tell them, you know, because again, New Center was created as a sort of like a official and civil society opposition to the dominant trends in the art world. We always take this position of like criticality towards the art world, which consider itself the pinnacle of criticality in the world. But we think this critical field, art world, needs its own critics. And if you go back to the history of New Center, a whole group of us actually in 2013, before the New Center begins, myself, Reza, Ray Brassier, Sohail Malik, Diane Power, this is prior to Xenofeminist Manifesto. We all came together as a way of dealing with the problems of the art world. So this is sort of like why New Center is sort of like related to the developments in the field of contemporary art and art in general, and why we think it's an essential component of it. Yesterday a very important French artist both applied for a certificate and became a member of the New Center. And I'm not going to name names, but very, very like top layer. And we're just sitting there going like, why would this person want to be a certificate student of New Center? They're in their early 50s, but we're like, hey, thank you, you know, join us, no problem, you know? So this is sort of like what I wanted to bring in. Now, if there's any questions for me or any questions you, Katherine and Martina have, just pose it, because I would like to just end my presentation and go prepare for Aladdin's. Aladdin has done a great project about like how to bring the world of Internet of Things and connectivity to beehives, and how to technologize beehives for the future without letting new liberalism kind of do this. So he's doing a presentation about like cybernetic beehives in about an hour at New York IBEAM, and I'm kind of like one of his examiners. So yeah, so go ahead if there's any questions, I would love to answer.
Thank you, Mo. Yeah, that's a great introduction. Maybe we'll just raise one brief question to follow up on some of what you've said, specifically looking from the perspective of the artist or the curator who might be involved in this program. Since you've spoken a lot about how your program is interacting with the rest of the center, I wonder if you could say just a few more words about how the New Center's unique institutional model enables a specific and novel kind of study of art and curation that's different from study that takes place in a geographically rooted institutions, especially because artists, you know, people who work in the arts often have a fraught relationship to their institutions. There's always a sort of double bind of trying to seem autonomous, but not necessarily being independent.
Yes, I think the most important thing that distinguishes us is that we don't offer studio courses. There's no such a thing as that dreadful exercise of critique where like the whole seminar has to stand in front of the art, either interrogate the artist. In some models in the United States and Canada, the artist can't even say a word. I think in Yale is like that. You just stand there and you hear what your professors and other students do to your work. And it's very intimidating, and it's very, in my opinion, very destructive. In other models, the artist is allowed to take the mic and just go on and just make claims about the work that basically bind the hands of others to say anything critical about it, right? Here, we don't have studio seminars, or at least we haven't tried to do studio seminars online. We're mostly sort of like theoretical and sort of like looking at practices, artists coming and talking about what they do and disclose their methodologies, right? Rather than our students being put on a spot that way, like we all do in a studio setting. And also the fact that, you know, it's like New Center acts as like this very special place away from the art school, because most people are either in an MFA program or in a PhD practice program, or they've been And it's sort of like, it's a special place in your library where you keep your cool books. It's just functions like that. You know what I mean? And then you decide how to bring elements of it into the new center. You decide if you want to ask Reza to maybe like collaborate with you on writing something for your catalog, or ask Mo to sort of like come in and do something with you. Aladdin is an artist, right? So, you know, it's kind of like work, like, it's like what Reza was saying. It's like your nutrition cabinet for the artist, right? You already got your art going. We're just going to help you make that studio practice more rigorous, basically. So this is really how it works. And also for curatorially speaking, my goal has been to show young curators that, like, you know, like creating a book of lists, putting a few famous artists and not a few non-famous artists, and coming up with some like trendy topic is not what all curation is about. What I do at the New Center is curatorial. I put together educational programs. So think about how to think outside the box about curation and think outside of what curation can do. You know, another example of it, if people want to follow up, is Misal Adnan. He was on our board and he taught a very amazing seminar last semester on curatorial. And sort of like, as he finished that seminar, he installed his first show as the co-director of a very important Kunsthalle, Baden-Baden Kunsthalle in Germany. And you could just see how his experience of New Center and his own methodology, how kind of transformed how he did this first show. Basically, it was a show of schools. They invited particular classes of students. So the students of Simon Denny in one art school, students of Hito Sterol in another school, and students of another, what's his name? Yeah, a student of this musician, I forgot his name. He used to be in the super cool techno band Mouse on Mars. Jan. So Jan brought his sound class, and Hito brought his class, and then we were also there to kind of like facilitate all the online stuff. And you could just see how out of box this project was, to actually bring the artists. They lived in the museum for a week. They performed, they made art, and they occupied basically the museum at the beginning of the semester. But also it was the first show after the first round of the pandemic. I mean, the museum's closed now, we all know. We're all screwed up right now. But in that window in September, October, Baden-Baden Kunsthalle did really something amazing that is sort of like along the lines of what New Center has been striving to do. And it was really amazing to work with them on this.
Thank you so much, Mo. We know you have to leave early, so thanks for taking
early, but like, please try to get the questions off the floor if they're not too funny. Like somebody asked something from Reza, but I think it was just a joke. But there was some question for Ed maybe. So yeah, so thanks for having me. Thank you, everyone. And I'm always available. You can always message me on Facebook, find me, and ask me questions if you have about the program, about the New Center, and all that. So I'll go get prepared for the other Zoom meeting.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so on that note, we will maybe take this question from one of the viewers of the program for Ed, who's asking if you can speak, Ed, more about what kinds of projects the students of PostPlanetary design will be making during the program and this final projects.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, everybody. Thanks. It was super inspiring to hear from Mo and Reza and Jason. I have to say, Jason, finding techniques to turn substance against itself and overthrow destiny resonated very strongly with me. And Reza, I don't know if you're still there, but I was an obsessive reader, although my parents didn't think I was going to go into engineering. Actually, they sort of did. They had a kind of a track for me to go through the Air Force like my dad did, and then into engineering and mathematics. And they were, you know, crushed when I became a musician as a teenager. But they did take me to the Library of Congress when I was probably 11 or 12. I don't know if you know this story, Reza. And they just left me in the Library of Congress for a week while they went to all the museums in Washington. And I got every single book on H.P. Lovecraft by H.P. Lovecraft. And I immersed myself for a week in the U.S. Library of Congress, reading everything by and about Lovecraft. So that, when I was maybe 12 or 13, was my introduction to a number of themes that I know you and I both love. But let me go back to the question here. So Zenobia, I think, asked this question. Thank you for chiming in. Look, the point that Mo was just making about studio culture is very important. I've taught architectural design culture studios at the graduate and undergraduate level for more than 20 years. Carla also. All of our seminar faculty this year, or at least the ones we have confirmed so far, are both studio and seminar instructors. And they have more than a decade, in most cases more than 20 years of experience teaching design studio. Now, architecture design studio can run into all of the problems that Mo was outlining. It can be extremely psychologically stressful. It can be too much work. It can be monoculture. It can be driven by the egos of faculty who have absolutely no right to be critiquing their students' work, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. We'd like to believe that we've never done that in our design studios. And I feel pretty confident that both myself, Carla, and Ezio and Danielle have never done that, because we have been informed by this radical approach to transdisciplinary design thinking that all of the other program coordinators here that we've heard from espouse. We're interested in what it means to think design outside those boundaries. Now, I have to explain architecture, design culture, studio culture a little bit for 30 seconds. The culture that produced me and Carla, and again, Ezio and Danielle, and other people that we're going to invite across the year, is a culture that assumed 9 credits per studio per semester. In most programs, that would amount to more than half or half of an 18-credit load. In the schools that we were formed in the 90s and the 80s, that meant that you put 90% of your effort into your design studio project and 5 to 10% of your effort into everything else. That worked if the studio was good, and it failed miserably if the studio wasn't good. And so we've been thinking for these many decades about the good examples and the bad examples, and how to make sure that the bad examples don't happen. When I was an acting director of the master's program at Columbia University back in the early 2000s, I taught there for more than a decade. I was part of many curriculum committees. This was at the forefront of what we were thinking about. We all saw good studio culture, and we also saw bad studio culture. So what's the way that we're approaching this at the new center? Well, one, obviously we can't have a 9-credit design studio, but we can have a design studio that runs as a kind of, Jason, to use your term, carnival across the entire year. And we can have studios and seminars, studios in quotes, and seminars taught by people who have all taught studios and seminars. And they know the challenges that one faces when teaching across a range of different modalities pedagogically. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to assume that the studio, again in quotes, in the PostPlanetary Universal Program runs across the whole year. And it'll be the equivalent in terms of time commitment to a 3-credit course, but we'll be thinking in design research terms, in design terms. In terms of my background, Carla's, Ezio's, and Danielle's, I know we all have taught together for more than 15 years now. We always approach design studio by thinking outside of design. We always run mini seminars, reaching out to philosophy, reaching out to the sciences, reaching out to the arts, reaching out to film, in my case, intensively. I always use dozens of films as part of my architectural teaching approach to embed a critical approach to design inside what we normally would see as a design culture, a design studio culture. In terms of what you'll be expected to do, it depends on whether you're taking a certificate or if you're already enrolled in an undergraduate or graduate program and you want to use what we're doing as Mo, as Reza were saying, as a kind of an amplifier, as a vitamin, as a supplement, as a parallel track which allows you to crash test what you're doing in the program that you might already be enrolled in. If you're enrolled in what we're doing as a certificate, then presumably you'll focus more of your energy on doing design and design research across the year in the PostPlanetary Universal Program. But if you're already matriculated in an existing program somewhere in the world, then what we'll be doing is working with you to help you crash test what you're doing in your own educational program based on the experience that we've had doing this for more than 20 years. So it really will vary from student to student what you'll be expected to do based on the time commitment that you make, whether you're in a certificate or not, and based on what you talk to us about what you want to do. You could very reasonably approach us and say, hey, look, I want to focus entirely on world design this year with you, because that's what you're saying is the nominal theme of the program in the first semester. And that's what I want to work on all year. You could treat it kind of like a design research thesis project for the year. Or you could come to us and say, look, I'm doing my graduate thesis program, and what I need to do is I need to find ways to think outside the curriculum that's being offered to me in the program that I'm in. Can you help me do that? So again, it really will vary from case to case. Briefly, one more thing I can say about the program. The way we're imagining it, we do have a thematic across the year, which begins with world, moves on to atmospheres, and then finishes with cosmos. So by the end of this first year in the PostPlanetary program, we will have taken on each of those themes. We'll also be running a symposium or a lecture series each semester. This first semester, we will be very lucky to have Lydia Kalapalidi, Stephanie Wakefield, Peter Watts, and Ben Goertzel do our inaugural lectures. Lydia is an architect and engineer who's done extensive work on closed world system design, brilliant scholar and designer and professor. Stephanie Wakefield, a geographer who's done a substantial amount of work in the past few years on what it means to think about designing for the back loop. And she's a kind of a contra sustainability thinker, really dynamic, brilliant lecturer. Peter Watts is the science fiction writer who everyone should also know is a marine biologist, the author of Blind Sight and the Rifters trilogy. Peter has gifted us with his time many, many times over the years, and is going to join us to think about what it means to imagine designing organisms, ecosystems, and intelligence at the postplanetary scale. And Ben Goertzel, who I mentioned before, is an artificial intelligence designer and engineer who's again going to join us. Now, the reason I mapped them out is they will participate in the spring by doing basically just guest lectures in a lecture series, but we'll have a symposium at the end of the spring semester, which I hope they'll be able to rejoin us for. In this symposium, all of the students in the program will present their work, are invited to present their work. And we've done this in the past. When we ran the PostPlanetary Capital Conference in 2014, some of the PostPlanetary students presented. Similarly, with the PostPlanetary Futures event in 2018 at the New School, students were invited to present. And we always do this in such a way to avoid the kind of downsides of studio culture that Mo very rightly unpacked. We're not interested in that kind of studio culture. So it's an invitation, it's not a requirement. It's an invitation which is usually about confabulation and support. So I think that's an attempt to summarize the way that there could be a range of different outcomes depending on the student's time commitment, either to the certificate program or just to an individual course or series of courses. And at the end of the year, we're going to be running as a cap for this first year a conference on cosmopolitics, which I've spoken already to a number of other folks at the New Center about. Dejan and I have been talking about this. Dejan Lukic, the professor who's teaching in Transd with Jason, we've spoken about this for a few years, and this is going to be an opportunity for us to, to create a capstone for this first year that I hope can also cross-fertilize with the other programs at the New Center really intensively. And that will be an opportunity as well for students to present their work, whether it's done internal to the PostPlanetary program or other New Center programs, or externally. So we're looking for a way to, Jason, thank you for that term, to amplify the carnivalesque aspect of what we're doing. And it really does depend on the amount of time that each student brings to the course or to the program. So thank you. I hope that's a clear summary.
I think that's a great summary, Ed. Thank you. And with our remaining time, if there's no other audience questions for the moment, I think we'll just go back to Reza briefly, if you're there, for one follow-up question about what we were discussing before. Since we've spoken a lot about the transdisciplinary and the interdisciplinary approach that's a real thread throughout the New Center, we wanted to ask a bit more about how you feel this operates within philosophy, given that the interdisciplinary would seem to be a somewhat unnatural terrain for philosophy as a discipline, given the crucial importance of a kind of self-reflexivity and an attention to the structure and form of reason as opposed to its content. So I know you spoke already a little bit about how you're looking sometimes at a lot of different sources. And in particular, I know that some of your programming looks into computational rationality, as well as into the problem of worlds, which maybe is another way through which philosophy can approach this idea of in the interdisciplinary or knowledge in between various conceptual schemes. But I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about how and whether this is relevant to how you think of philosophy as a field. Well, not as a field, but as a practice, really.
Yes. Actually, I mean, people who are familiar a little bit, I always refuse to recognize philosophy as a discipline. It is not a discipline. It's a designer space. It's a designer space for me. So what is the notion of a designer space, right? You know, I'm going to make it very cheesy engineering metaphor here, right? It is something we engineers call topological optimization. And there are softwares for that, right? So think about this. I mean, design a space, for example, think about that. Why is that a tree looks like a tree topologically from in terms of shape and so on and so forth? Why is that a blade? So think about this, that you have a blade and a branch. You would say that this is natural, this is artificial. But the thing is that if you actually go back to the idea of design space, the difference between naturality of a wood branch fallen from a tree and a blade goes away. How so? Precisely because evolution is a design space itself. And you can always create different forms of design space by introducing different parameters. Stephen Jay Gould has this famous idea, which is called this allegory called rewinding the tape. Rewinding the tape means that, look, guys, if you think that, the reason that I, as a human being, look like this, a goat look like that, a tree look like that, this and that look like that, it's precisely because our imagination is basically entrenched within the design space in which we participate, or idea of Plato's methexis, Plato's idea of participation. So we take things for granted insofar as we do participate in them. But then imagine that you can actually rewind the tape such that this design space or a space of methexis, allow participation in forms, would be different. Where trees look like human bodies look like blades, and all sorts of kind of things, different constraints and parameters. So I'm approaching philosophy precisely as a design space, as a space of participation in a Platonic sense of methexis, meaning participation in forms or constraints, positive constraints, enabling constraints. And my idea of philosophy is that if we diversify or reconfigure these parameters, this space of forms or participation in ideas or forms or idices, we can fundamentally think differently. Radically, in the same way that we could imagine that a human body might look like a crystal rather than like an organic shape, right? To participate not in the organic shape, but in an organic shape. Isn't it the whole point of artificial intelligence? Right? So I am only interested in these kinds of stuff precisely because for me, they open a gate, this design space, they open a gate for reconfiguring parameters. And what I know of philosophy is that we need to have as vast as possible of a design space that allows us to reconfigure such parameters of participation in ideas, methexis in ideas. Otherwise, we can only parroting the ideas in which we have already been submitted to. There is nothing interesting in it for me. It would be just something like bad politics, not philosophy. Thank you.
Thank you, Reza. So I think we are getting towards the end of the session. If there are no other questions, I think we will go ahead and wrap up. So thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you especially to the programmers for your time for this discussion. It's been great to speak with you, and thanks to all the viewers as well for being with us for this first session of the new season of Sheltering Places. And we look forward to seeing you later in the season as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Thank you,
Love you
everybody.
all.